Hello folks, here I am at the Robert Frost Farm on the 28 bypass in Derry, New Hampshire. It's a property that Frost lived in and farmed from 1900 to 1911. He was born in San Francisco, moved from there to Massachusetts, was living in Methuen or teaching in Methuen, Mass, and then came up here and began farming, and from that point on, he was associated with New Hampshire and Vermont. Even though he lived many places, he was teaching at the University of Michigan and other places for a number of years. But this is where he essentially started using the New England countryside as raw material for his poems. So I'm standing outside the Frost Farm, and we'll do segments of this video from various places on the farm property. So the cool thing about the farm is, as you walk through the property, or you can tour the barn inside, there are places with information about Frost, and also parts of his poetry, either entire poems or fragments of poems. Here, sort of an introduction, it includes one of Frost's most famous poems, "Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening." And again, a lot of his early poetry was inspired by his activities on the farm. Supposedly he was not a very good farmer, but he lived here for 11 years farming it, writing poems, and then moved to London, where he published his first book. But that book, published in London, included many famous poems and poems that were written while he lived in this property or inspired by his decade living here. So as you see here, stopping by woods on a snowy evening. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it's queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bow a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Now, this poem is often overanalyzed as a death poem or such. It sets a mood, and the cool thing is actually the craftsmanship of the poem. If you look at it, we have in each stanza 3 lines that rhyme and 1 that don't. No, though, and snow. But the unrhymed line here becomes the basis for the rhyme in the following stanza. So here, queer, near, year. The unrhymed line here is lake. It's lake, shake, mistake, flake. Then the unrhymed word is sweep, and that becomes the key for the last quatrain. Deep, keep, sleep, and sleep. So the cool thing about the property is, and if you can turn around and show behind you the house, so that is the farmhouse, and then as you continue around, you can see the meadow that goes around, lined by woods. The stone wall here that sort of lines this meadow. It's fitting, I think, that the poem Mowing is here. I'll read this portion. Robert Frost once said that the sigh and the pen were his favorite tools. Though his main living during his Derry years came from farming, then teaching, his pen was never idle. He was writing a lot of poems, even though he was, again, supposedly not a very good farmer, but somebody who at least did till the land. Mowing is, I believe, one of the students this semester wrote about that poem in her reader's response, where he describes the sound of the sigh sweeping over the meadow, sweeping over the grass, almost sounding like a whisper, as if the sigh is whispering to the meadow. So one thing that is cool about walking here is you can find elements that Frost used in terms of his poetry. One of his most famous poems, early poems, is Birches. It's represented here. I won't read it, but you can see behind me is a relatively old white birch. If anybody knows what birches look like when they're young, the white around them are very vibrant. The fact that this is sort of old and appears to be not in the best of health, tells me it's a very old tree. but there are various parts of the farm that you can see a direct representation of in Frost's poetry. If you know Frost's poems, you know that he writes a lot about these stone walls that were erected all over New England. Mending Wall is one of his most famous poems, which he read at the recited actually at the inauguration of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, with the idea of the wall then representing the Berlin Wall, at least in the context of his reading at the inauguration. Actually, the poem itself predates the Berlin Wall. If you know anything about New England, is if you're ever walking through the woods, you'll find these stone walls essentially everywhere in the middle of the forest. The reason being is they were erected to mark boundaries of fields, and over time, sort of the fields were overgrown with trees. So if you're walking and you see like an old stone wall in the middle of a woods, wondering what it's doing there. It was probably erected in the 1700s when the land where there's woods now was actually cleared fields. Fun fact, I think I read once in 1800 there were fewer forested lands in New England than there are now. The reason being so much land had been cleared for farming. And then over time, the farms were overgrown by trees. So this represents the fact that this was, it's at the edge of the field, but in a lot of cases it marks where there was another field behind it. Okay, so here I am at the corner of the meadow. You see behind me sort of where the stone walls intersect. Something else I should mention about stone walls. I mean, they were built because the fieldstone that formed the walls were plentiful. And as farmers cleared their fields, they needed to do something with all the stones that they gathered up. So they would use them to create these stone fences, basically. And the stone is, even if you're walking through the woods where there isn't a wall, in New Hampshire, you can come across these things pretty much littered everywhere. The forest beyond me is, preserved. I think it's owned either by the state or by the town of Derry now. But at the time that Frost lived here, it obviously was much less populated than now in terms of the town. So having a farm out here would have been more in terms of being in the wilderness. Wilderness maybe is wrong, but it would be more secluded from surrounding neighbors than currently. So this is the Frost farm, right? There's also a Frost place where Robert Frost lived up in Franconia, which is much more removed and much more remote. It's beautiful property if you ever go up there and have a chance to see it. But here in 1900, the town of Derry was small, more condensed, and so this would have been, a bit of a distance away from not civilization, but from his nearest neighbor, certainly. So again, we're at the edge of the Frost property. Hyla Brook, which is a Springfield brook that goes past here. Frost wrote a poem about it. There's also one of his famous poems is West Running Brook. Of course, east of the Mississippi in the Northeast, most streams will run east towards the ocean. But there's a brook in Derry that's called West Running Brook because it runs west instead of east. And near that site now, there's actually the West Running Brook Middle School in the Derry school system. But if you look around here with all the ferns and this walking bridge and such, it truly is that these are lovely, deep, dark, lovely woods. So very cleverly, they have at this point where these two paths diverge. Frost's probably his most famous yet most misunderstood poem is The Road Not Taken. Where it's not really saying I took the road less taken. It's basically is looking back, a perception of what was reality. I took the road less taken, yet it was equally worn. So it really wasn't less taken. It's just the idea of reflecting on a different path in life, and it's all pretty much amounts to the same. But it's cool how they just had it this placard right where these two paths kind of go off in different directions. Okay, so we're back at the meadow. We've just, if you want to pan around, we've just walked on the edge of the property back through the woods. I didn't stop at every place where there's a little placard, but you can see what looks like crabapple trees around me. After apple picking is a poem on here. That's one I think I talked about in class when I was talking about metaphor and such. Beautiful poem, so I invite you to read that. It's a little bit of a longer poem, so I won't read it now. But that's an overview of the Frost property. Again, it's on the 28 bypass in Derry. It's free unless you do an actual tour inside the house, in which I think she said it was $4 for New Hampshire residents. But it's free to come here and just walk around the property. It's a beautiful place, lovely in fall, actually lovely every season. So check it out sometime. Thank you.